Right, so according to the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA, and the World Food Programme, over 1 million Palestinian children are now acutely malnourished, many on the brink of death. Families are reduced to grinding animal feed into flour, boiling weeds for soup, eating leaves from trees, and drinking contaminated water as Israel renders water desalination plants inoperable. Aid distribution points, lifelines for hundreds of thousands, are repeatedly struck by Israeli airstrikes, leaving bloodied sacks of flour scattered around. This is not a humanitarian accident, it is a deliberate military strategy. It is, in the words of South Africa's genocide case at the International Court of Justice, a policy designed to inflict conditions of life calculated to bring about the destruction of a group in whole or in part. And yet the best the so-called champions of human rights in the West could muster, by way of a response to this, was a strongly worded letter, for which the mainstream media have offered gushing praise. Yesterday, 28 nations, including the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and several other European states, issued a joint statement condemning what it euphemistically called inhumane killings at food distribution points and demanding Israel stop its drip feeding of aid and just let aid in properly. Well, I'm sure Israel were shaking in their boots over it. Right, so for all of the diplomatic choreography, this letter was hollow from the moment it was signed. Within hours, the United Kingdom, under Keir Starmer, launched yet another RAF Akrotiri spy flight over Gaza, providing intelligence, allegedly to find hostages that most Israeli politicians seemingly no longer care about anyway, no longer prioritise and rarely even mention anymore. Intelligence that is almost certainly being used by Israel to refine its targeting for other uses. It was as if the UK had signed the letter with one hand while feeding Israel targeting data with the other. Gaza's starving children cannot eat these words on this sheet of paper. Better fit Keir Starmer could, and history will judge this letter not as an act of moral courage, but as a symbol of Western hypocrisy and complicity instead. It is thin gruel, and that's still more than most Gazans have got to eat right now. The famine now gripping Gaza is not an unintended byproduct of war, it is a calculated policy of starvation. UNRWA and the World Food Programme have documented catastrophic food insecurity, with entire neighbourhoods surviving on grass and animal feed. Mothers are boiling weeds to feed their children, and desperate families are scavenging through rubble for literally anything they can find edible. UN data suggests that over 80% of Gaza's population is now on the edge of famine. This is not mere deprivation, it's deliberate. Israel has maintained a total blockade on food, medical supplies, fuel and clean water since October 2023, tightening restrictions this year to what even some Israeli officials have privately called a starvation siege. Trucks are regularly turning back at border crossings for arbitrary security reasons, sometimes delayed for weeks while perishable goods rot in the back. When convoys are permitted through, they're allowed in at a rate far below what is required to sustain the population, and of course Israel are employing and protecting several terror group cast-offs to loot what little does get in. The drip feeding of aid that the letter condemned is in fact a systematic method of exerting collective punishment, but the letter is too weak to even call it that. The bombing of aid queues is the clearest sign that starvation has become a weapon. Just this month, in the umpteenth strike on GHF aid hubs, an airstrike on an aid distribution point in Al-Mawasi killed more than 70 people queuing for flour. Reuters confirmed that over 800 civilians have been killed at or near aid queues in recent weeks. Israeli forces have repeatedly struck these sites despite being given their precise coordinates by the UN. Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi reacted to these massacres, calling them a clear example of war crimes and crimes against humanity, demanding that international courts take action, far more than these 28 nations have said in their joint letter. Article 54 of Additional Protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions explicitly prohibits starvation as a method of warfare. Article 2C of the Genocide Convention defines genocide as deliberately inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about physical destruction. Starvation as deliberate policy is not only a war crime, it is an act of genocide in and of itself, therefore. That Western nations avoid this term is not a matter of prudence, but of political convenience and covering for their own complicity. Why does the letter avoid legal language and that word genocide? Because calling this genocide would impose obligations on them to actually do something. Under the Genocide Convention, signatory states are legally bound to prevent and punish genocide. That would mean halting arms sales, suspending intelligence cooperation, imposing sanctions, and even pursuing prosecutions at the International Criminal Court. None of the 28 nations is willing to take such measures. This letter was not written for Gaza's starving population. It was written for Western audiences outraged by images of skeletal children. It is, in short, optics diplomacy. By signing it, leaders like Keir Starmer and Mark Carney can posture as humane without changing policy. The absence of the United States and Germany from the signatories only underscores its political hollowness. Israel's most important allies refused to endorse even this tepid condemnation. The United Kingdom's actions in the hours following the letter's release exposed the true value of its signature, though. As Squawk Box revealed, Britain launched another RAF intelligence flight from Acutely over Gaza almost immediately after signing. These flights are not humanitarian monitoring missions, they are intelligence operations. These flights collect communications and electronic signals identifying potential targets for Israel, but we're supposed to believe they are looking for hostages that Israel shows scant intention of rescuing. This intelligence is dual use. Given the pattern of repeated strikes on civilian infrastructure, Britain cannot plausibly claim ignorance of how this intelligence may be being used by Israel. But it also serves to remind us why Starmer is running away from that word genocide like the plague. This makes Britain not a passive bystander, but an active participant. Under Article 3E of the Genocide Convention, all stuff Starmer should be aware of course, as a former human rights lawyer, let's not forget, aiding and abetting genocide is a crime. British lawyers have already warned that continuing arms exports and intelligence sharing may make the UK legally complicit. Meanwhile, the government continues to approve export licenses for components used in Israeli aircraft, further binding Britain to the siege. Starmer's government has tried to frame its signature on the letter as evidence of moral concern, but its actions speak louder than its words do. The UK is condemning with one hand and enabling with the other. While Western states equivocate, the Global South has taken a clearer moral stance. Iran's Abbas Araghchi has explicitly accused Israel of war crimes and crimes against humanity, language far stronger than anything in that 28-nation letter. But Iran are the bad guys in everything, right? South Africa continues to lead the genocide case against Israel at the ICJ, detailing the Starvation blockade as a deliberate act of destruction. Brazil, Bolivia, Colombia, Indonesia, Malaysia, they've gone further than most Western states, imposing trade restrictions and halting arms sales. It's a bitter irony that the nations most demonised by the West are now speaking the language of international law more consistently than the self-proclaimed defenders of human rights are. This hypocrisy is not being lost amongst the Global South either, where Western values are increasingly viewed as a mask for geopolitical self-interest. Western leaders often justify their refusal to act by claiming that Israel faces an existential threat from Hamas, which refuses to negotiate. Yet as Al Jazeera reported that Hamas responded in a positive spirit to a US-backed ceasefire proposal in early July. This undermines the claims that the blockade and the starvation are purely security measures. Hamas have even welcomed this Weasel worded letter for what it offers, but they hope it'll lead to something more meaningful. If Hamas is willing to negotiate, the continuation of collective punishment therefore cannot possibly be about security. It's about breaking a people's will and eradication instead, isn't it? The West's ability to issue hollow statements depends on media complicity. Mainstream outlets like BBC and CNN describe Gaza's famine as a humanitarian crisis, sanitising what is blatantly genocide. Yet by contrast, alternative media such as Squawk Box or Press TV have been blunt, calling starvation a deliberate weapon of war. This reporting has fueled public protests across Europe and elsewhere, where demonstrators are demanding not letters but sanctions, arms embargoes, and an end to intelligence cooperation. The West's response to Gaza recalls earlier failures, though. This is standard for them. During the Rwandan genocide, leaders expressed deep concern while doing nothing to stop mass killings. In Bosnia, Srebrenica became a byword for Western inaction. Gaza's letter will likely join these moments in history as a document of shame, frankly, because no praise is warranted for a letter written 22 months into a genocide saying, "Well, please stop, we'd be awfully grateful for it, signed your besties in Europe." There are also parallels to apartheid South Africa here. Just as boycotts and sanctions eventually helped dismantle apartheid, similar measures would pressure Israel to end its siege. We know it worked before. But the political will that existed then is absent now, replaced by risk-averse, optics-driven diplomacy, in nations where leaders are too beholden to Israeli influence and lobbying. If the ICJ rules that Israel's blockade constitutes genocide, states that continue to arm, fund, or assist Israel could face accusations of complicity. Universal jurisdiction cases might, in theory, target officials like Keir Starmer or David Lammy, as a Tory MP called Kit Malthouse informed in Parliament just this week. Many might view such a course of events politically unlikely. We've seen too many leaders get away with such things. Tony Blair springs to many people's minds, when you think about that, of course. But such cases would set precedents that Western leaders can no longer act with impunity, and at some point, someone is going to have to be made an example of to show politicians they are not above the law. Real action is neither complicated nor unprecedented. An arms embargo, the suspension of intelligence sharing, targeted sanctions against Israeli officials, and joining South Africa's ICJ case would likely pressure Israel into lifting the blockade. Spain and Ireland have already taken steps, freezing arms exports and pushing for EU sanctions. That the UK and others refuse to do even that shows where their true priorities lie. For Gaza's starving children, this letter is not hope, it's an insult. It was written not to stop bombs or open borders for food to get in, but to shield Western leaders from domestic criticism. History will remember it as evidence of moral cowardice, just as it remembers Western inaction during Rwanda and Bosnia. The West's claims to moral leadership is collapsing, all while the global South emerges as a more credible defender of international law. Gaza cannot eat words. Those who signed this letter while continuing to arm and assist Israel will be judged harshly by history, by law, and by the very people they pretend to care about. For more on the outcome of that Global South Summit, the first such meeting of the Hague Group, and what action they're going to be taking against Israel going forwards, and which rather bad news for Benjamin Netanyahu personally too, check out this video recommendation here as your suggested next watch. At least some nations are determined that Benjamin Netanyahu and his government are owed a reckoning. Please do also hit like, share and subscribe if you haven't done so already, so as to ensure you don't miss out on all new daily content, sort of spreading the word and helping to support the channel at the same time, which is very much appreciated, holding power to account for ordinary working class people, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.